I love C.S. Lewis. I love reading C.S. Lewis. I pulled a stack of his books out of my library just to prove it with Narnia on top. I've read them all. That's not an exaggeration. But I'm a Dallas Willard expert. I have read way more of Dallas Willard, and I can, I guess, defend my opinions about Dallas Willard. Now, I have heard for a long time that Dallas Willard, he's like America's C.S. Lewis. If you want C.S. Lewis with an American accent, then you should go for Dallas Willard. And I kind of think this misses the point. I know people are trying to say something nice about Dallas Willard and to introduce him to new audiences, but honestly, I think this confuses people more than it helps them. Now, we're going to do this. We're going to do a Dallas Willard versus C.S. Lewis. So I've got 15 categories, and if you are a Lewis person, then I'd love to hear if you think that I've got Lewis a little bit wrong, and I guess same goes for Dallas Willard. Hey everybody, welcome to the Sanctus Forum. I am Michael Stewart Robb, better known as Mike. The Sanctus Institute, we are in Europe. I live in Munich, not far from Oxford, where C.S. Lewis was active, but pretty far away from LA, where Dallas Willard was active. If you want to know more about what we do, we've got a newsletter over at sanctus.institute, and you can see what we're about and why we talk more about Dallas Willard than C.S. Lewis, and that may become rather obvious as we go through these 15 categories. I think we should start with their biographies. The first category is length of service. Dallas Willard grew up in a Christian family, never really had a time in which he was far away from Jesus. And so that means that at age 19, he starts doing preaching on the streets, preaching in jails. And then at the age of 78, when he retires or dies, you can add up 60 years of being in service as a minister, as a professor, as a writer. That's quite a long time for anybody. Now, Lewis, he does have some kind of Christian faith when he's a child, but he, as we all famously know, walks away from that and doesn't come back to it until maybe age 31, 32. It's hard to really pinpoint that date. And then he lives until about age 63. So we've got a period of about 30 years for Lewis and a period of 60 years for Dallas Willard. That really stands out to me, that Dallas Willard has decades upon decades of doing what he does. And so I think that's a point for Dallas Willard, just distinguishes how they stand out in what God called them to. Second, vocation. Dallas Willard accepts ordination into his own denomination, the Southern Baptist, when he's in his early 20s. And I think that really stands out because that never is something that he says, well, I'm not doing that anymore, even when he takes a job at USC as a philosophy professor. Lewis, however, is an Anglican. He is well aware that he does his work as a layman, and that meant that he had a little bit of reluctance to be a pastor to people. Now, as we'll talk about later, he was an apologist. He talked about his faith. That's just went along with what he felt he was supposed to be doing. But as a kind of guide for other people's souls, that's not what Lewis really thinks about as his job. Whereas for Dallas Willard, that's part of what he feels that he's accepted. So for here on this one, we've got very different kinds of vocations that these two men are called to. Third, the university. Both of them are at universities, and that is a major point of similarity between the two. The universities are rather different. Lewis is over at Oxford, and he becomes a full professor at Cambridge. Dallas Willard is at University of Southern California. Obviously, Oxford, Cambridge, you've heard of them because they are more elite schools, let's say. University of Southern California, not a bad place to be. Now, Dallas Willard becomes a full professor, I think at the age of 47 or something like that, full professor of philosophy. Lewis is going to have to wait until he is 55 or something like that to become full professor. There's some reasons why Lewis didn't get that professorship earlier on. Willard is actually working kind of from the top of his field, at least in his area, earlier on than Lewis is. Lewis is still kind of in the lower ranks for a lot longer time. Now, lower ranks at Oxford, and that's perhaps not that bad. Higher ranks at USC, who knows where they would have landed if they were actually at the same school doing the same kinds of things. But difference here. Now, what about where the knowledge base of these two men is? The fourth category is philosophy. Now here, this shouldn't be a big surprise. Dallas Willard, he is a full professor in philosophy and a very good philosophical professor. He has competence about the whole range of philosophical subjects. He has his research areas, which is typical, but he has an incredible knowledge of the whole history of philosophy and could lecture within minutes about almost anybody in that field. Lewis did study philosophy in his days as a, I guess, undergraduate, graduate student. So not incompetent, and you can see that in his writings, but he is an amateur philosopher. Fifth, imagination. Well, of course, this one's going to go to C.S. Lewis. Dallas Willard says that imagination is an area of knowledge, and C.S. Lewis agrees with this. Lewis is a literary professor, English professor. He knows literary criticism very well. He knows literary history very well. This is where his major expertise is, but he's also incredibly good with pulling images together, and he has an incredible knowledge base in images, in imagination, and this extends down to poetry. And so on this one, he's just blows Dallas Willard out of the water. Dallas Willard isn't bad, but Dallas Willard's definitely an amateur. However, it's worth pointing out that Dallas Willard did teach English in high school, and that he was very interested in these kinds of things and read a number of classic literature authors and could comment on them fairly easily. 6, theology. Now, this is an interesting one. Some people might think that they need to say neither of them are very good at theology. Dallas Willard is obviously not teaching theology, but he is incredibly well-trained and well-read in theology. You might call him an autodidact, although his graduate degree is basically in theology, and he keeps up with all this stuff. He would need to brush up on some things if he was going to just start teaching theology classes like at a seminary, but not an amateur in theology. And this goes with him being a minister. He felt that he had a responsibility to know about the things of God. Lewis, on the other hand, clearly an amateur, very interested in theology, a very keen reader, probably a better theological reader than most of us. Still, when you look at what he's doing, it's more clear that this isn't really a field that he's capable of saying very definitive things in, though he balances that out with his great capacity in imagination. 7, the humanities. So this is an interesting one. I'm kind of lumping a bunch of things together, but obviously both of these people are incredibly well versed in what people were talking about in the humanities, what the Germans called Geisteswissenschaften. Dallas Willard surprisingly knows a lot about political theory, about sociology, about psychology, about history. Lewis, not bad, although if I were to choose between whose class I was going to go to in psychology or sociology, maybe everything except for history, I would pick Dallas Willard. He teaches these things at the university in team-taught courses, and he's reading quite extensively in these areas. So this one, I think, is going to have to lean towards Dallas Willard. 8, ministry. So ministry is also a field of knowledge, how people would care for other people as pastors, as prophets, evangelists, these kinds of ministerial jobs. And this one here is going to go to Dallas Willard. In fact, I think you would or should hire him in a moment to teach at your seminary and teach other people how to be a minister. And in fact, that is what he's doing. He's teaching classes about that for notable seminaries like Fuller. C.S. Lewis obviously knows a lot about human nature and does do ministry types of things, but obviously being a layman compared to Dallas Willard being an ordained minister, he's just not quite as up to speed on how one ought to work with a church, work with people in a church, these typical ministerial things that clergy do. And so this one certainly goes to Dallas Willard. 9, wideness of intellect. I don't quite know how to name this one, but both of these men are incredibly well-read. And so if you had them in a conversation at home, in the pub, they could talk about all sorts of topics, and their intellects are just so wide-ranging. So it goes well beyond just what they know about the humanities or what they know about their field. They can talk about sciences. They can talk about popular events. And so on this one, I think this is really quite a tie. And if you think of either of the two people, oh, well, maybe they just stayed in their narrow lane, then you just need to look a little deeper. Well, then there are a couple of categories that I'm going to label skill, and the first of these is 10, writing. Now on this one, C.S. Lewis is by far a better writer than Dallas Willard. C.S. Lewis is just the kind of person that all writers should look up to. He's incredibly capable, particularly in his prose, and anybody that can imitate him, 10% is going to be a much better writer. Dallas Willard, not a bad writer, certainly can pull together great phrases, even wrote poetry, which few people know, but not exactly somebody that you would kind of put up on a pedestal and say, oh, learn to write like this guy. So this one definitely goes to C.S. Lewis. 11th, speaking. Who is the better speaker? Let's say this. Dallas Willard did probably way more speaking. He did all of the typical lecturing that you would do at the university, and he did things on campus as well. But he's also speaking in churches, and he eventually does have a pretty national and international ministry. He's flying on planes, flying across oceans to speak, certainly much more in demand as a kind of speaker. Lewis doesn't have that kind of work. Lewis does speaking in his area, but he's not really being flown here and there to speak. Lewis, from what we know of how he could speak, was very engaging. People enjoyed being in his lectures. Apparently he would pack out lecture halls. We have some audio samples of what he did. He did these great BBC radio lectures, which became Mere Christianity, and then other ones which became the Love Book. I can't remember the name. The Four Loves. Dallas Willard is a bit odd too, because Dallas Willard had two modes of speaking. There was the Dallas Willard that just showed up and spoke, the unprepared Dallas Willard, the one who just wrote an outline and just went for it. And then there was the very polished speaker, Dallas Willard. As Dallas Willard gets older, the polished speaker, he tends to not play that one very often, which is interesting, and I think is because he started to think that he should imitate the Apostle Paul and let God carry the results and not just polished speaking. But if I was going to learn from one of the two on speaking ability, I guess I would go and learn from Dallas Willard. 12, being a public intellectual. This is one where people see the similarities, and clearly they both stand out for being on the university and being open about what they think and what they believe, and it's a kind of position that you could wish more Christians on the university adopted. You might call this apologetics. That fits Lewis quite well. It doesn't fit Dallas Willard very well, though he was writing a book on apologetics for at least a decade of his life and did kind of do some teaching on that. Wasn't really known as an apologist, though he did a whole lot more of it than most people realize. Lewis is there in his university. He's part of a club which discusses ideas and thinks about how to communicate them to the wider world. And Lewis also has this way of doing it through the imagination and playing to his strengths. Dallas Willard's way of doing it is much more, again, plays to his strengths, his knowledge in philosophy and theology, and he's more the defense. He's going to wait more till somebody comes to him and asks questions. He's going to help more people who are in a place of doubt rather than Lewis, who might go and kind of take a stand somewhere. I think this one's going to have to go to Lewis for his success at doing it, particularly through the imagination, though I think in terms of style, I would tend towards doing it Dallas Willard's way. The last three categories are about reach or legacy. So 13, audience. I think on audience, it really stands out that Lewis has a much more diverse audience. People read Lewis who do not believe or think like he thinks. He has old readers, young readers. He has sophisticated readers as well as simple readers, whereas Dallas Willard's audience is much more restricted. Dallas never really managed to write a book which went out to a general audience and sold well there. He's much more of a niche author. He's writing, perhaps not intentionally, but by virtue of what he wrote about, more for Christians. Now, it's possible that their time periods are such that it was possible back in Lewis's day to write for a more general audience as a confessing Christian than it was when Dallas was doing his work. At the same time, Lewis is much more active in being a writer. He's trying to think up new book ideas and taking them to publishers, whereas Willard is more passive. People have to pull books out of him, and then they are for this more niche thing. It would be really interesting to see if you could put together a general audience book out of things that Dallas Willard wrote or spoke on. I think it could be as good as what we see from Lewis, not as well written, and obviously not going to come out of this imaginative knowledge that Lewis has, but the market may not be the case where you could actually put out a general audience book from Willard yet. Therefore, the point, or certainly in terms of diversity as well as size in Lewis's audience, is huge, goes to Lewis. 14, notoriety. Well, this should be a rather obvious one. C.S. Lewis is far more well-known than Dallas Willard, and that has to do with the fact that his books appeal to this much wider audience, and because he's just a better writer than Dallas Willard. So Lewis, perhaps deservedly, is a much more well-known author. Dallas Willard is more like these very good niche authors who aren't going to disappear anytime soon and probably never will, but they're only going to be read by a segment of the population. I think of a person like William Law, whose books are still in print, but if you don't know who that is, that probably proves my point. Maybe a little bit more well known is somebody like John Calvin, but so many people, they might know him, but they've never actually read his books. Lewis, by contrast, could end up possibly like somebody like Cicero or Geoffrey Chaucer or Pascal, somebody who is a part of world literature. Perhaps we can't judge that yet, but his books, the general audience, the quality of them could be that kind of thing. 15, mentoring. So this last one is a question of who would be better to learn from. And obviously, it depends on what it is you want to learn. If you want to work on that imaginative literary history, literary criticism stuff, if you want to be a good writer, then of course, go to C.S. Lewis. If you're interested in philosophy, if you're interested in theology, being a minister, that's certainly where Dallas Willard stands out. However, Dallas Willard also stands out in the fact that his work does tend to be meatier, thicker. You can really dig in and find lots of intricacies to this, and that's something that I think I've never really found from Lewis. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that Dallas Willard is more likely to be the foundation of some kind of school. How big that school would be kind of depends on a number of things. Whereas Lewis does have his followers, but you probably couldn't live there for very long. You're going to have to pull in other things to help train yourself and think about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a follower of Christ. And that's where the Dallas Willard stuff has a lot more substance and meat to it. Who to compare Dallas Willard to? Who is he America's response to? Well, I've thought people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer are a better person to compare Dallas Willard to see the similarities to. Or maybe if you go back, somebody like Søren Kierkegaard, or maybe somebody like Jonathan Edwards. Of course, these are all more niche people, but they're niche in a very important way. They really want to say something very important about what the gospel is, about who God is. They want to talk about philosophical foundations, metaphysics, and build a kind of way of thinking from there. And C.S. Lewis, as great as he is, such a great writer, is doing something very different than that. And that's what confuses people, I think. They would expect from Dallas Willard somebody who's this fabulous writer, who's very imaginative, and in the end, he's not. He's just a guy that worked at the university and was a kind of public intellectual in his day. And for that reason, I'm going to be reading both of these people, and I hope that you will too, and come along with us for the journey. See you next time. Bye. Ooh-wee, that was a long one.